Okay, so it's nice to meet everybody. My name is Anna Hennessey, and I would like to thank Dr. Giovagnoli for inviting me to this presentation. I will be presenting collective intentionality and the transformation of meaning during the contemporary rituals of birth. This is something that I have been working on. Well, I haven't looked specifically at collective intentionality until this talk. However, I have a book on social ontology and the rituals of birth. So I do mention collective intentionality in that book. This paper is going to go more in depth into this concept of collective intentionality, which Dr. Giovagnoli, I saw the title of your paper, and it seems as if we kind of have, I'm very interested in what you're going to present. All right, so I will show my slides and I will read my paper. Okay. This talk examines collective intentionality, one of the three fundamental elements in a classic theory of social ontology, and how we locate its emergence in the way that individuals and social groups transform the meaning of art and other objects used in the context of contemporary birth rituals. In this context, religious art and other objects often undergo an ontological transformation during the rituals of birth when participants secularize them, marking them with new status functions that diverge from their original functions as religious objects. And let's see those, okay. All right. However, some of these same objects are then resacralized when used ritualistically during birth. In these cases, the social ontology of the object shifts away from that of a religious or secular identification, collectively re-identified and in some cases institutionalized instead as encompassing sacred meaning. This sacredness is not part of the object's original symbolic function as a religious object. However, instead, the object is resacralized and takes on new ontological status associated with an institutionalized collective understanding that the non-religious act of birth is a sacred act in itself. The term collective intentionality here derives from John Searle's 1990 paper, Collective Intentions and Actions, which Searle then developed in other works, including his 1997 book, The Construction of Social Reality. Contemporary philosophers such as Michael Bratman, Margaret Gilbert, Ami Thomason, Raimo Tuomela, and Dan Zahavi, among others, have made important contributions to the study of collective intentionality. Other scholars have also examined similar concepts, sometimes using different terminology, such as is found, for example, in French sociologist Émile Durkheim's study of what Durkheim termed collective consciousness. This paper primarily utilizes the term as found in Searle's classic theory of social ontology, studying examples of how individuals involved in birth rituals become organically part of a larger production devoted to the making of new meaning out of objects used in these rituals, especially art objects. As such, we note instances in which the individual thinks at the level of the whole, not as that of the part, even though the social context of transforming meaning is inextricable from the personal context of experiencing the ritual of birth. In The Construction of Social Reality, Searle begins his discussion on social ontology by explaining that the human social world or social reality comprises facts from two fundamental ontological categories. These facts are so-called brute facts, which are non-institutional and are based on the physical world, and institutional facts, which depend on the faculty of human agreement. The former category encompasses all aspects of our world that are devoted to its scientific makeup, independent of human experience or institutions, Although many scientific theories are problematic and remain to be proven, Searle believes that two scientific theories, the atomic theory of matter and the evolutionary theory of biology, are indisputable and form the foundation for an objective ontological reality descriptive of all matter in our world. Within this scientific ontological framework, however, exists a second separate, distinct, and real world, which is the reality of the social world. It is within this reality that we do not experience material objects as merely material objects. A particular piece of paper only has meaning as money, for example, because groups of people have come to collectively understand and use it as such, thereby institutionalizing the object. This second ontological category devoted to social reality emerges from the scientific world when three fundamental elements intersect to define the meaning of the activities and objects of human social experience. These three elements are function, collective intentionality, and constitutive rules. Here's a brief outline of these elements described in Searle's The Construction of Social Reality. The first element of classic social ontology is function. Humans experience many objects not according to their intrinsic and scientific ontologies, but in relation to the object's functions within their social context. These social functions differ from scientific functions in that they are intentional, observer relative, and independent of a causal structure. Coins and cash function not as metals and paper, for example, but as a medium of economic exchange. Collective intentionality, the second element, refers to intentional states that humans share. These states include belief, desire, and intention. Collective intentionality is not composed of individual intentionalities. Instead, singular human intentions are part of and derived from the collective intentionality that individuals share. As such, collective intentionality can neither be reduced to individual intentionality, nor can it be described as a collective consciousness, as Emile Durkheim would term it. It is a special type of mental cooperation between individuals. Searle gives examples of a violinist who plays a part in a collective symphony performance, and of an offensive lineman playing a part in a collective football game as representative of collective intentionality. In these cases, the individual's performance, while distinct, is organically part of a larger performance. The individual thinks at the level of the whole, not as that of the part. Animals also express collective intentionality, though this intentionality is attached to collective behavior that is biologically innate. Therefore, although animal collective intentionality is a type of social fact, it is not institutionalized in any way. It is not an institutional fact. It is a social behavior that is still lacking in institution. Searle's third element, constitutive rules, is perhaps best explained when contrasted with regulative rules. Searle offers the examples of driving a car and playing chess to demonstrate the difference between these two types of rules. While driving has rules, one can perform the task of driving without these rules. So the rules of driving are regulative and not constitutive of driving. In other words, the rules do not necessarily constitute what it is to drive. However, the rules of chess are integral to what chess is as a game. And so without the rules of chess, there would be no chess, and instead only pieces bumping around on a board. The rules constitute what it is to play chess. According to Searle, once these three elements of function, collective intentionality, and constitutive rules interact and become descriptive of something in our world, an occurrence that only happens through human cooperation, that something becomes a social fact known as an institutional fact. Searle later divides institutional fact from institutional object, stating that the former refers to social activities such as financial regulation, and the latter refers to objects of the social world, such as money. This talk now examines the social ontology of art and other objects used in the context of contemporary birth rituals, looking specifically at collective intentionality and the way in which individuals and social groups transform the meaning of these objects when they communicate with one another about how the objects can be used during birth as a rite of passage, and then institutionalize this usage. In certain rituals of birth, those who are involved in the process of birth, including women, partners, midwives, doctors, etc., have historically used different objects as part of the rite of passage. Metaphysically speaking, the ontologies of these objects are defined by their physical makeups. The complete ontology of the individual object, however, rests on another level, a social level, which is dependent entirely upon how people have historically and collectively defined, used, and perceived of it. This is the social ontology of the object. Of interest to this talk is the social ontology of different objects used in these birth rituals, as well as how the ontologies of the objects have the capacity to change depending on how groups of people think at the level of the whole, and not the individual, to collectively perceive of the object's meaning and make use of them. The object that this talk uses as its main example is the Xiaohong. The name refers not to a single object, but to a type of medieval stone figure carving from Europe, often referred to simply as a Sheila, whose original meaning has been interpreted in a number of ways. Scholars disagree on the original meaning of these objects. Some scholars believe that the Sheilas were historically understood as sacred devices used during the pre-Christian rituals of birth, while others believe that the figures functioned primarily as apotropaic devices, collectively understood and carved for the purpose of protecting churches and other buildings. Another group of scholars disagrees and believes that these objects acted as didactic representations used to transmit Christian themes of sin and a collective understanding of the female body as profane. Regardless of the precise original meaning of the Sheila figures, most of the research shows that the objects were historically used within the context of religion. The common social ontology of the object, as it was originally conceived, is therefore understood to have been of a religious nature. In contrast to these varieties of religious ontology, however, the Xiaohong is today often understood as a secular tool that can help pregnant people during birth. In other words, the object's social ontology is of a secular nature and not of a religious one. Using a theory of social ontology, I now explain the way in which the object's meaning has gone through a transition from religious to secular identity. In the 21st century, groups of people are secularizing and re-sacralizing the Xiaohong and other objects like it, collectively utilizing an understanding of these objects in a new way during birth as a rite of passage. These social groups transmit novel meanings of the object to one another through writing, in-person presentation, the internet, and other technology. In this slide, I show you an artwork entitled Pregnancy by the Chinese artist Xiaohong Zhang. Jiang has discussed the impact of Chinese philosophy and religion on her creations. This image has been secularized and shared widely within the birth community, an example being the detail of the artwork as found on the cover of the San Diego Reader in reference to an article about birth doulas. This rapidly growing interest in images of birth has gained international presence through online image sharing and networking, and through small exhibitions, including a permanent collection, the Birthrights Collection, which opened in 2008 at Goldsmiths University in London. Some of the people who form a broad birth community include artists who create artwork about birth, as well as others interested in using the artwork for personal or professional reasons, including pregnant women, fathers, partners, doulas, midwives, doctors, writers, childbirth educators, yoga instructors, and acupuncturists, among others. Many of those involved are interested in ways to facilitate labor and birth, often with a focus on natural or alternative methods. However, this community of people interested in these objects cannot be defined as a natural birth movement, since its focus is not on natural birth, but on how objects and representations of birth are associated more broadly with birth as an important rite of passage. Collective representation of the object's function is often public, and we can locate important speakers within various institutional contexts related to birth. And some of these examples would be the Midwives Alliance of North America, American Pregnancy Association, the Positive Birth Movement around the world, and various doula groups around the world. And these people, they intentionally convey information to any of a wide number of hearers, including pregnant women, their partners, midwives, doulas, yoga instructors, and others, such that these hearers understand the purpose of the religious object X to count as something that has a non-religious status function Y in the context of C, which is birth, thereby assigning new deontic powers to the user of the object in the secular context of birth. Identifying a group through which collective intentionality takes place is important, as are the mechanisms through which an idea or an object becomes institutionalized. While an idea may originate within an individual or individuals, it is the percolation of the idea within the group, marked by speakers who designate meaning to others, referred to as hearers by Searle, who then transform the meaning into an institutional fact. Renowned American midwife Ina May Gaskin, for example, has written and presented prolifically on the topic of birth for over 4 decades, and has described the practical utility of the Sheila Nagig to her readers. In her widely read 2003 work, Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, Gaskin encourages those who are pregnant to use the Sheila Nagig and other objects like it during pregnancy and labor, stating that the object can be used for visualization purposes. Looking at the object during labor, claims Gaskin, can help a pregnant woman to visualize her own body giving birth, which in turn influences the physiology of birth. Doulas, yoga instructors, and others in the birth community also encourage the use of the Sheila Nagig for practical purposes during birth, though Gaskin's voice is one of the most influential in this regard. Gaskin, a highly influential midwife, writer, and past president of the Midwives Alliance of North America, has a wide readership and popular presence in the United States and abroad. And she highlights the object's basic utility as a visualization tool that can aid a laboring individual. In this slide, I look at how Gaskin's statement that objects like the Sheila figure can be used to visualize birth, and that this visualization is helpful to the process of actually giving birth, is epistemically objective. This means that all humans have the capacity to report the use of visualization as a tool in giving birth, though the actual and experiential phenomenon of visualizing birth has a subjective mode of existence. In this slide, I show the case in which there is a collective recognition and a declaration that the religious object X, in this case, the Sheila Nagig, can be used for secular purposes, Y, in this case, that of visualizing the physiological process of birth by looking at the object, whereby visualization is seen as a practical tool to help in the context of birth, which is C. Following the classic theory of social ontology, in this case, a new status function has been assigned to the Sheila Nagig, and deontic powers have also been assigned to the actual user of the object. Similar to the way in which secularization of the religious object occurs, there are instances in which the ontologies of these objects shift again, in this case, away from a secular ontology and towards a resacralized one, in which the object functions in a sacred but non-religious way. This sense of the sacred is humanistic and stems from an understanding of childbirth as a sacred or spiritual act in itself. When the object is resacralized in this way, we again locate public, collective representation of it in its new form. New status functions and deontic powers are again assigned. In their contemporary context, some objects used in birth as a rite of passage become sacred in a new way during the rite transformed by their users. In the case of the Sheila na gig, for example, artisans today have created resacralized forms of the object, making an array of sacred charms and pendants of the figure to use for birth and fertility or as gifts. Although the objects are not religious, some of the language used to describe them, such as mother's blessing necklace or birth blessing bracelet, indicates the sacredness of the objects. Another similar case in which collective intentionality arises in the creation of an institutional object's new meaning occurs when a birth altar is secularized and subsequently resacralized. The birth altar is a sacred place in the home, usually on a table or in a corner, that some pregnant women, sometimes with her partner and her children, creates as she prepares for labor and birth. Objects such as pictures and sculptures related to birth and mothering, written birth affirmations, candles, and ultrasound photos may all be part of the altar. An altar is itself a religious structure, and objects included on the birth altar also sometimes include religious objects and images, such as those of the Virgin Mary or the Buddha. However, in the context of the contemporary rituals of birth, the altar is often not a religious altar, but instead a spiritual place for the woman and her family as they prepare for birth. A picture of the Virgin Mary may be revered not for its religious content, but because the Virgin is also a universal symbol of a woman who gave birth. In these cases, the collective representation of the Virgin Mary figure functions symbolically as an object to be used in preparation for birth. Although for some members of the social group, the original religious ontology of the object may carry over into the ritual of birth, particularly if these members are Christian religious practitioners themselves. However, for those members who are not religious, the object takes on new meaning, and its social ontology becomes transformed and is of a non-religious nature. A collective understanding of birth, institutionalized through a wide variety of speakers who communicate with the public through various forms of literature, technology, and visual media, results in an advocacy for birth as a powerful human event through which an object's social ontology may transform. The social ontology of many objects from the human world may transform depending on their context and the institutions from which they derive. In the context of this talk, the objects I have discussed take their meaning from religious spaces and then become secularized or resacralized. Individuals cooperate in this process, transmitting new meaning to the object. Similar to the case previously mentioned in which the social ontology of the religious object transformed to a secular ontology, in these cases, there is collective recognition and a declaration that the object X has a sacred but non-religious ontology Y in the context of birth, C. A new status function has again been assigned to the object, and deontic powers have also been assigned to the actual user of the object. Collective intentionality is integral to the philosophy of social ontology and an understanding of how it emerges during the contemporary rituals of birth when participants in the ritual define an object's meaning more broadly, shows how the symbolic functions of material objects have the capacity to shift between religious, secular, sacred, and non-religious identifications, depending upon a social mental cooperation about what those functions are. And that's what I have today. So that's the end of my talk.